So I'm really happy to introduce Professor Catrin Westphal from University of Göttingen. She's a professor in agroecology, and as we all know, then just preserving nature in nature reserves is not enough. We have learned that a hard way already, and agricultural lands are really, really important when we really want to halt the biodiversity loss in Europe. So I think I will give the floor to Catrin, and we are going to hear about agricultural lands.
Okay, thanks, Catrin. Yeah, thanks a lot. It's an honor to be the keynote at this restoration conference, and to be honest, it's the first time my group is joining this awesome conference, which is mainly driven by a restoration project we do in grasslands, also in Estonia, but also in Spain and of course Germany. And let me just see, I sneaked in the restoration in the title, but I would like to keep in mind that restoration is, of course, restoring degraded land, but it's also about restoring processes and functions, and this is mainly where our research comes in. So please understand restoration in a more general perspective. The group is based at an agricultural faculty, so our research is always considering agricultural production in some terms. We have a growing world population, and we have also had quite steep increases from the Green Revolution in terms of agricultural productivity, but when you look very closely at this figure, these trends are leveling off. So it is predicted for at least Asia and the global production. You can see this flattening of the curve, which means there either need to be novel technologies or we need to change the system in a new way. I will come to that later. And you also know from the news and from many discussions, perhaps also here at the conference, that there is something going wrong with intensive agriculture, and therefore we have these European frameworks like the Green Deal with the farm to fork strategy, where it stated that we need to transition towards sustainable food system, and even the restoration law points out that we need to enhance food security. Why is that the case? So there is more and more evidence that agriculture in a conventional, highly intensified, or even industrial way is causing habitat loss. It's done through processes like land consolidation. There are consequences of very simplified or monocrop sequences. In Germany, we have the issue of corn for renewable energies, where you need high fertilizers and pesticide inputs to have these really monotonous crop sequences still very productive. And this way of producing goods leads to habitat loss, degradation, and fragmentations. And with that, we also lose species. And associated with these species, we of course also lose ecosystem functions and services. This figure illustrates the correlation between species loss, and here we have the farmland bird species as an indicator, which is very well documented, compared to high input farming across Europe. And you can see this coincides. We have higher losses there where we have high productivity, or we have high input-based agriculture. So what can we do? And we can do many things. We can think along these really nice illustrated gradients from Ola Lundin. We can further choose the way of continuing with high external inputs to sustain productivity and to control, for instance, pathogens and pests. But we can also see that we can become more proactive and more biodiversity based. And there are different trajectories we might want to go. And one way, which was framed by Ricardo Bomaco quite a while ago, is the so-called ecological intensification. This means what we have done with fertilizers and pesticides can also be further enhanced through ecosystem services. So reduction of these agronomic inputs while maintaining high yields through the promotion of ecosystem services that are lacking in the systems. This can be done at different scales. So one can just use biotic inputs in the production systems. One, of course, can manage at the crop or at the field and at the farm level. This is what the farmers in general do. And one can also broaden the scope and take the whole landscape into perspective. If you want to do this, then you really have to take the farmers with you, because they are the landowners and the land managers, and they need to agree what's happening on their land and in their agricultural landscapes. And one idea which came up already in 2015 is the idea of collaborating at larger spatial scales. So implementing measures not only at the field scale or managing single landscape elements, for instance, extensively managed grasslands, but rather taking the focus at the larger scale, which is the landscape. But then you need to cooperate, then you need to bring farmers together, and we discussed this already in some sessions. And from these collaborative landscape schemes, you can gain ecological benefits, but also social and economic benefits, which could create win-win situation. So I would like to discuss with you different practices, measures along this triangle. And the first one is rather about these biotic inputs or the management of ecosystem services. And now we have to go far south to South Africa, sorry. This is a project we did in highly intensified macadamia plantations. Macadamia is, at least in Germany and especially in China, a highly demanded nut. And I think most of you will know it maybe from cosmetics, but also ice creams or pure nuts are available and becoming more and more popular. And South Africa is one of the largest macadamia producers, and they are heavily expanding the range of macadamia orchards. And within this setting, Mina Anders conducted her PhD on ecosystem services in macadamia plantations, and she focused on pollination and biological control. And first, she conducted the pollination experiment where she excluded pollinators. She had an open treatment and then a hand pollination treatment where she put pollen on the inflorescences to have the maximum pollination possible. And then she also looked at the initial nut set. So this is the formation of the little nuts directly after the flowers dropped, and the final nut set. And this final nut set is, of course, this is what matters for the farmer. And as you can see, macadamia is highly pollination limited. So with the hand pollination, Mina achieved 540% increase of initial nut set. And what then happened is what you see here. Macadamia produces a very high amount of initially set nuts, but they all fall down. And there is some research going on why this is the case, but this is not really solved yet, because there are also studies showing the trees could produce more nuts, but for some reason they fall. But anyway, still with the final nut set and the very reduced amount, you can see that the pollination is still an important factor in enhancing the productivity in macadamia. And then we also tested different treatments in these macadamia orchards which could contribute to ecological intensification. So first, we used more like a standard setting where we wanted to know whether there are differences between the edges and the centers of these orchards, because the edges were related to some natural habitat structures at the borders of the orchards. Then we also looked at the row orientation of the trees within the orchard, so whether they were either in parallel or perpendicular towards these adjacent semi-natural or natural habitats. And then this is an old practice which is used in different crops, the plantation of different varieties so that you have a higher diversity of pollen donor plants, which can also benefit the production and enhance pollination. And then we also tested agronomic practices. One was the addition of honeybee hives in these orchards, and the other one was irrigation. So all orchards were managed in a conventional manner, so the pesticides have been applied all over the orchards except for our studied trees, and they were not sprayed. And what we can see here is that we have differences between the initial and final nut set from the edge and the center. And interestingly, we found, for also unknown reason, higher nut set, final nut set in the center of the orchards. This can also be due to predation by monkeys who sneak in the orchards and rather steal from the outside than the inside. But there might also be other factors. We really didn't test that and don't know. But one really surprising result, which was also uptaken by the nut industry, is that this row planting has a significant effect on the initial nut set, which also translates later to the final nut set. And this is very interesting because just with planting the rows differently in newly designed orchards, you can enhance the pollination service when the pollinators can be facilitated to fly into these orchards. And the already known practice also showed higher pollination success. But the two agronomic treatments, like the managed honeybees and the irrigation, they didn't show any effect. What Mina also did is she caged the trees so that she could exclude bats and birds, which are known to eat or predate on the pest species in macadamia. And we also had the edge and center treatment. And here we investigated the damage to the macadamia nuts. So these nuts are damaged by some insect pests. This is here the macadamia nut borer, and of course nuts that look like this cannot be sold. So it's about nut quality in this case, while these nuts, they can be shipped to global markets and sold as pure nuts in any kind of product. Interestingly, we found that the nut damage is decreasing with increasing semi-natural habitats in the surroundings of the farm. So again, we found that these semi-natural habitats are an important source for service-providing organisms that can benefit the farmers. And then Mina came up with this really nice figure illustrating the mechanisms she investigated. And One central rule is the semi-natural habitat, which can enhance the pollinators and at the same time reduce the insect damage in the macadamias. What is also important for production is that you do not promote disservices with the measures that enhance the ecosystem service providers. So when you want to promote pollinators, but at the same time you promote insect pests, this doesn't really create a good situation. And this is what we found here. So the semi-natural habitats and this row planting are complementary measures that can do both, like promote the birds and bats and also the pollination services. So if the farmers think about the design, they can definitely do some ecological intensification on their farms. Then we looked in 2 smaller studies on spillover effects and how they are related to ecosystem services. Spillover means that you have some source population of service-providing organism. In our case, again, predation and pollination, and that they swap over into the agricultural habitats which are in close neighborhood and therewith provide services, or again, this can also, of course, be harmful to the crops. The first study was led by Marco Ferrante, and here we used these really nice artificial or sentinel prey dummy caterpillars. These pictures come from, a different project. I stole them from the Interest project, but anyway, it's to illustrate how these caterpillars look like and how they are placed in the nature. And here we looked at hedgerows with different species richness. And what Marco could show is that the plant diversity of the hedgerow is related to the total predation rate. So the more species are in the hedgerow, the higher was the predation found on these artificial caterpillars. And he also looked at the landscape effects and placed these caterpillars in 2 different landscapes. One was very simplified and the other was more heterogeneous. And here we found that in the more homogeneous landscapes, we have a higher effect of the hedgerows and the spillover towards predation. So concluding from this study, even small elements can have like more local benefits to crops, in this case enhancing the predation services or biocontrol. And in a similar setting, we also looked at strawberry pollination. And this is a master thesis done by Denise Castle, and she placed potted plants next to different hedgerow types. So one was a connected hedge to a forest. So there was a forest edge, and then there was this hedge. Then an isolated hedge, as you just saw in the picture, which was a hedge pretty much isolated in the agricultural landscape. And then as a reference site, the grassy margin. And we looked at the berry weight, and we found that the berry weight was highest at these well-connected hedges. And this was just a pollination experiment alongside where we bagged the flowers just to see whether it's pollination or other effects. And you can see that open pollination has a positive effect on the berry weight. And we also looked at the pollen beetle damage, and we found some damage, but this damage was not related to our experimental setting. And what is really nice about strawberries is that you also can quite easily quantify the fruit quality. I mean, perhaps you remember in the summer you go to the supermarket, and of course you are looking for the big, round, nicely shaped berries. That's the one of these trade class or commercial grades 1, which have the highest quality and of course gain also the highest prices for the farmers. And these are rather jam or yogurt, strawberries, which can be used elsewhere, but not sold as fresh fruits with the highest prices. And again, we found the same effects. We had the highest fruit quality in these well-connected hedges, and this is quite an older study. At that time, we used the actual market prices, and one could see that the prices are enhanced for like €5 per 1,000 berries, which is also quite substantial because the farmers, of course, do not have like limited amounts. They really produce many berries, so this is a significant economic benefit. Another example from our research is related to legumes. Legumes can fix nitrogen, and therewith they have beneficial effects on soil fertility, especially for the following crops. And there are also yield increases documented. At the same time, legumes have flowers or even extrafloral nectaries that provide nectar and pollen for flower-visiting insects, and thus they can represent an additional resource of food for pollinators and other insects. And the significance as ecological focal area or eco-scheme is highly controversial because these are conventional managed legume fields, which of course are then again treated with pesticides. In her PhD thesis, Nicole Bayer focused on diversified crop sequences, so at the local field scale with legumes, and she compared faba bean cultivation in the landscape. This means FB minus and plus, so when we had faba bean field in the landscape, this was a faba bean landscape. If there was none, this was the reference again. Was the control. And what she could show is that over 3 runs, there was a beneficial effect on the bumblebees, but she didn't see any effect of faba bean cultivation in the landscapes on the non-bombus bees or mainly solitary wild bees. Some of them are not strict solitary, that's why we said non-bombus bees. So we saw some positive effects, but also only on a selected taxonomic group. Then we dig further into the data and found nice results for the entire bee community. Here we looked at the species richness of all wild bees, including bumblebees, and we found, and this is not surprising, a positive effect of the flower cover, but also a positive effect of the landscape diversity, which is enhancing wild bee richness. And from these 2 studies, we could conclude that faba beans or other legumes might benefit pollinator communities in agricultural landscapes, but only those bees benefit that are really well adapted to the faba bean flowers. And these are mainly bumblebees and not so many wild bee species. And they really need more diverse food resources at landscape level. As we're still talking about ecosystem services, this is also something Nicole quantified, and she looked at the faba bean yields here as dry matter yields in relation to bee density, and then she found an surprising interactions in landscapes where there was very few oilseed rape fields. The bee densities did not have an effect on the faba bean pollination at all, but in landscapes with really high high oilseed rape amounts, there was a positive effect. And then we were a bit puzzled because we thought, well, if there are oilseed rape fields, why does this somehow influence the faba bean pollination? So they are not flowering at the same time, or at least there's a very, very short overlap. And then we looked again at these different functional bee groups, again, the honeybees, the short-tongued bumblebees and the long-tongued bumblebees. And what we found is that honeybees and short-tongued bumblebees, which are also not the main faba bean pollinators because they have short tongues and they rather steal nectar by biting a hole in the corolla, they were declining. But the long-tongued bumblebees, they were stable in the fields and continuously providing the ecosystem services. So from this study, we concluded that the yield formation is really depending on which pollinator and which traits and foraging preferences they have. And landscapes can also be managed in a way that this can be enhanced. So concluding from this like biotic enhancement and field scale studies, one can say, well, one can improve the cropping practices and the landscape design to enhance ecosystem services or complementary ecosystem services. And one also needs, of course, and this is nothing new, enhanced landscape connectivity. And it is also important to manage domesticated and especially wild pollinators, which are an insurance group to provide stable ecosystem pollination services. In terms of biodiversity, the wild bees indicate that we need diverse habitats at the landscape scale to sustain diverse bee populations, and also the restoration of elements in the landscapes is very important to achieve this high level of landscape diversity. Now I would go one step further down in the triangle and focus on landscape scale studies. And this is a bit illustrated here. Here we have an example from the biodiversity exploratories in Germany. This is a grassland and forest-based study, long-term study system, and we only worked in the grassland part. And the grasslands have a land use intensity gradient, which is determined by mowing, grazing, and fertilization. And maybe some of you heard that already. And we added a landscape gradient to this, ranging from very complex landscapes to highly simplified landscapes. And to disentangle these local and landscape scale effects. And this was a huge collaborative effort led by Sagrario Games and David Perovec, who compiled data sets that were collected within the biodiversity exploratories. And we wanted to disentangle the effects of in-field intensification, so higher land use intensity, and the trade-offs between like simplified landscapes and heterogeneous landscape, and whether they filter for certain traits in the arthropod communities. And we looked at the taxonomic diversity, but the main focus was on the functional diversity based on different traits of many different arthropod taxa. But first I would like to explain what I already have been talking about. This is the landscape gradients. So down here you see an increase in landscape diversity. That's more different land use, land cover types. And here, when you compare this, you see that there is an increased configurational heterogeneity, meaning we have more wrinkled patches with more edge densities and different perimeter area ratio. So these are the two gradients we are looking at in this study. We compiled a data set with more than 35,000 arthropods from almost 600 species, 599, and 6 orders. And we collected the traits in terms of activity period, the relative body size of the species, and also their feeding specialization indicated as adult feeding breath or larval feeding breath. And then we conducted the multivariate RLQ analysis, combining the landscape characteristics with the traits and linked this through the abundance of the species. And what we found is what we call trait syndromes. So here are our gradients, the land use intensity, the landscape composition measured as landscape diversity, and the landscape configuration, so the patch complexity measured as perimeter area ratio of the fields in the landscape. And we really found 3 different trait syndromes, which is at the local scale, the land use intensification filters for species that are rather large, so can disperse very well through the landscapes, and generalistic in their feeding preferences. In terms of landscape diversity, we found that the feeding specialists clustered together, and here this indicates that in more diverse landscapes they can find their nutritional needs, while this cannot be achieved in really simplified landscapes. And the dispersal poor, the small generalists, they can be found in landscapes with a high configurational complexity, which facilitates dispersal. So in the end, we could show that there is a trade-off between local intensification, and this can be mitigated by landscape heterogeneity. So it doesn't really matter a lot if one farmer intensifies, if the surrounding landscape is still intact and can provide either dispersal routes or enough habitats. Now I would like to connect a bit to the quarry session, because we also have a quarry project in our group, which is just recently finalized by Felix Kirsch. The picture will come on the next slide. And here we investigated not quarry restoration, but we looked at quarries as secondary habitat for bee species, because quarries, and you know this, have the same habitat characteristics as dry grasslands, and therewith can provide important additional habitats in the landscapes. And again, we combined landscape effects, landscape connectivity, and landscape diversity with different habitat characteristics of 19 quarries in our area. We looked at age, area, the state of succession, which means the cover of woody species in the quarries, and of course, the flowering plant species richness. And Felix found that there is an interaction between the local and the landscape effects. So here you can see the quarry age at the x-axis, and in this graph we show the interaction with the woody vegetation cover, and you can see that if the woody vegetation cover is high, we have a declining bee abundance, which is the densities of bees in these quarries, while if the quarries are managed and shrub removal is happening once in a while through different measures, or these are quarries that are not overgrown yet, then we have a positive effect of age, so that over time the populations develop well and become very individual rich. And in this graph, we looked at the landscape, or we found an interaction between landscape diversity and age. And here we can also see that if we have like increasing age of the quarries, we have a positive effect only at low landscape diversity, but at high landscape diversity, this is declining. So here we see that the management is very important along with the age and the landscape diversity. And what Felix also did is looking at the endangered species. We had 35 endangered species on our quarries, and you can see the results here. So here we found that there is a higher probability of encountering endangered species with increasing quarry area, so this fits nicely to the species area relationship. And we also found this interaction with habitat connectivity and quarry age. So we found the positive effect of quarry age when these quarries were very well connected to other quarries or semi-natural dry grasslands in our region. So here connectivity plays a really important role for the establishment of the endangered species, which were usually also the rare species. While the richness of endangered species is declining in landscapes with a very low habitat connectivity. So here again, one can say one can put conservation priority on quarries that are already well connected in the landscapes. These can be managed, and not so well connected quarries should be managed in a way, or the landscape should be managed in a way that connectivity is enhanced, and this will then benefit also the species of conservation concern. You remember that I initially said that we really have to think about bringing all our measures to the landscape scale, and the discussion on that is already ongoing for quite a while, because in the EU we have many measures that work at the farm or field level, but when you look at birds, pollinators, but also other arthropods, they are way more mobile and they do not utilize single fields in the agricultural matrix. They have different habitats they use, and always we need to combine our efforts in the landscape mosaic. And also these single site or patch-based measures, they do not have a very clear benefit for different species group. And as I mentioned initially, one way to improve this are collaborations of farmers or NGOs or governance structures that facilitate the cooperation at landscape scale, that identify trajectories for enhancing connectivity, or that think about which landscape elements or habitat types are needed. And this will then increase the efficiency of the methods. As you have seen, we found very many landscape-related effects that play a role for the local communities. And how can we do this? So we have to think about that these landscapes are social ecological systems where we have not only the ecosystems we have to take care of, but also the stakeholders. And we also need to think about how structures can be implemented that really help, for instance, connecting nature conservationists with farmers' organizations and also administrative authorities that can take care in the long run. And you can sit down, and this is what we did in one of our projects, to discuss with farmers where to implement perennial flower fields for one entire period of the Common Agricultural Policy. And we expect that there will be shared benefits from these measures. The whole project was a huge effort. We had to identify farmers who are willing to cooperate with us. We had great support by the local farmers' organization, because they built the trust for us that the farmers thought, well, we can collaborate with these researchers, and they seem to do something reasonable on the land, and they seem to have good ideas. And this collaboration with the farmers' organization was very important, because otherwise we would not have reached the goals. So overall we implemented 258 hectares of perennial flower fields in a district north of Göttingen. In total, we have 42 participating farms, and 11 farmers are cooperating in our study landscape. So the study landscape means 1 square kilometer of landscape where we implemented these perennial flower fields, and they have been sown in 23 with a regionalized seed mixture, which is only comprising wild plant species. And these were produced by a big seed company, and this was also a big joint effort because it was delivered centrally and then distributed to all the farmers. And we have also great support by the municipalities which support the project and also are very much engaged. So this is an example of how collaboration could work. Of course, this is not all over Germany and rather small scale, but I think the numbers are quite impressive. And this is more like what will come up over the next years. We do quite intensive biodiversity monitoring. We look at the birds and the bees, we look at carabits, and we look also at predation services and pollination services. We also look at parasitoids in pollen beetle larvae and oilseed rape. So we really try to target multiple taxa and multiple services, and we also are engaged in the education and communication of the results. This is a bike tour along the flower fields with information stands where we informed about what we are doing. The very first results from the project are two articles which are currently submitted or in preparation, which really try to highlight the importance of these collaborations and also the co-benefits. And I don't want to go in much detail, but one thing is that we really have to think about what do the stakeholders expect from us, what do they gain, what do they have to offer. Then we have to think about how such collaborations can be regionally facilitated through structures, like in our case, the municipalities that could help, and then the establishment of cross-sector networks like NGOs in the different farming, conservation sectors, and of course also scientists. And this can create benefits in terms of knowledge, but also exchange. And for the farmers in Germany, it is also important that they get recognition from the society, because many people, particularly in the cities, think that farmers do everything wrong, which is also not true. And it's also important to raise local competences. And all this together can then lead to successful collaboration at the landscape scale, which can also create synergies with benefits for the farmers, like the economic sector, but also for biodiversity conservation and also for governance. And so this is a more holistic thing than, or outcomes for the local communities. And with that, I come to the summary. So the examples I showed you along this triangle at the very beginnings are case studies, of course, from our own research, which can highlight some trajectories for transition towards more sustainable agricultural landscapes. And this is also based on the integration of crops. So flowering crops can contribute to pollinator conservation, which is also part of the restoration law, but as we have seen, not to all of them, and therefore, and here comes the restoration in again, we need restoration, or at least we need good management of still existing habitats. We need to increase the diversity of landscapes and especially their connectivity, and we should start thinking about the combination of different measures. So we can combine measures with the farmers that can still be productive, for instance, organic farming, or as you've seen, the diversified crop sequences, but we also need conservation efforts that promote these really biodiversity-rich areas that harbor also species which only can survive there. And I think one really important point, but this is also, or has also been raised in other talks, is the collaboration to get all these measures really in the landscapes. And I think this is important for really local activities. And I have seen this in many talks where these restoration activities are also very well connected in the regional settings. Finally, I'd like to thank all the funders who made this possible, or research possible. And of course, I didn't do this. I had the strong team behind me who did all the research in the different regions. And I thank my wonderful group. And for all of you, and this is the advertisement, who are interested in our research, feel free to check our homepage or follow us on Twitter. And I hope we can create these colorful landscapes together to have good effects for both biodiversity and the people who live in these landscapes.
Thank you, Catrin, for this really inspiring talk, and there is hope for our agricultural landscapes. Do we have questions?
Thank you, Catrin. Very nice talk. It's amazing what you do in your group, and you have this diversity of projects also, and composition and configuration of the projects are also very, very well done. My question would be related to the long-term trends. So you have, as most of us have, these 3-year projects or 4-year projects, and then you do a kind of intervention, and then you see something, or your people see something. But is that continued then over years or decades? And I'm only asking because in Göttingen you have this tradition of working for 20 years now, and maybe you have some old plots that you can use and reanalyze and see how things is. My second question would be related to the latitudinal trends. So this is Göttingen, or it's South Africa. But I wonder how these patterns you see and these processes you observe, how they change as you move along latitude. Do you have the same patterns here in Estonia or northern Sweden as you would have in northern Germany or southern Germany? That is something I would really like to learn.
Okay, I don't know. Maybe I start with this question. So we were surprised when we saw these results from the macadamia study. And this was really well received. And I think this was the first study. There were some studies in almond systems in the US. But was pollination related with wind. So I don't know the study. So it was Alexandra Klein and Claire Britton, I don't know, but so they did something in almonds there. I'm happy if people take up this idea and explore it further. I mean, this is where then later meta-analyses will show whether this row orientation matters or whether it's a very special case in macadamia. So, I mean, I know some research on almonds, but also not really on this row orientation. But the importance of the semi-natural habitats, this is shown across many studies. So this is not the novel part. It's rather about this ecological intensification, how you can manage, and that this row orientation is even more important than putting honeybee hives on these plantations. And regarding long-term ambitions, so we have a grassland experiment, which is still monitored by Johannes Isselstein at the agricultural faculty. They look at grassland productivity in a hilly region close to Göttingen. This is continued. And there have been this famous Ellenberg forest plots. They have been monitored for quite a while, but I'm not in this. So this is rather either the zoology department or the forestry. I don't know what's going on there. But I can answer regarding to our project, like this cooperative project where we established the flower fields. We started the monitoring 1 year before establishment, and we will continue with the same methods over 5 years, so that we have in total 6 years. And the aim is really to identify, and this is also how the project started, to think about how much land is needed to have like a good status of biodiversity. And this was the whole starting point. I didn't mention that. So local community approached us and they wanted to do something good for biodiversity. And then we said, well, we need to have some standardization in here. And then we came up with the flower fields, and they want to have like this Nutri-Score thingy for landscapes. And this is what we hope to deliver at some point.
Thank you. Do you have another question? Tippe?
Thanks a lot. It was a great pleasure to get an overview of what you have been doing. And it's really important, this knowledge for improving the management of agricultural landscapes. But I was just wondering about putting it into practice in the framework of this European Union agri-environmental frameworks. That what do in your study, when you are doing this cooperation with farmers, that do you see a trend that like smaller farmers are more eager to cooperate compared to larger ones? And then these really intensive and productive farmers, so sometimes there can be a difference. And then I was like thinking about this landscape scale approach, that currently all the subsidies, agricultural subsidies, are still like farm-based and field-based. And should these subsidy schemes completely change or shift, that you get some kind of a top-up when you do a landscape scale collaboration, or how do you see this being put into practice?
There's this famous Netherlands model where, I mean, the Netherlands, they have these collectives already. They have like they have identified regions where farmers are really supposed to collaborate. They have established governance structures that are also supposed to buffer the risk. So if the flower fields fail, the farmers don't get money, and this is like really regulated in these cooperatives. But we had a discussion in our journal club on how well they are uptaken, and they are uptaken in like regions where with like Mu Island, where you have farmers that collaborate already, but in many regions the farmers did not really adopt these schemes. So there are some difficulties related to that. And in our study, we have a good gradient of big and small farms. Of course, we have farms that give, like the big ones, they give us more hectare, but we also have small farms that contributed to our flower fields. So this is, I cannot tell the figures, I don't know whether Annika knows, but there is not a clear bias, let's put it like that. And I think what is super important is this, that you have people who talk to the farmers, who are active on WhatsApp. So we have a coordinator in place, Stefan Schüler, and he is the most patient person you know, and he's taking all complaints, he's diving deep into all problems related to these flower fields. And what we also have is like an NGO who's super familiar with implementing these flower fields. So if there are management questions, and there were many, so first the farmers didn't see the seedlings and they were concerned that there is nothing, then the weed problem. And there is also one person, she is also awesome, and just talking to the farmers, telling them, just wait, it will come, and there it is. And it's really about like having the right people, and I think this is the problem with the funding. And the EU, I think there are collaborative schemes already implemented in the Netherlands. We have the stewardships in the UK. We have it in Sachsen-Anhalt in Germany. They are coming, but I think how they are implemented, that's the tricky part. And the Netherlands model doesn't work perfect. So more research is needed all over Europe, I would say.
Thank you so much. Catrin has to catch a plane. So, and finally, we managed to finish the keynote in time.
Thanks.